Welcome to Meet the Press Reports, where each week we do a deep dive into a single subject. And today, in the second of 3 episodes, focused on key threats to our nation, it's cybersecurity. America's cyber war is escalating, and the more technologically advanced we become, the more vulnerable we are. Everything from cell phones in our hand to the electrical grid to our military is run by software code. Code that's written by humans. And all the things that go wrong there. So what happens when a human makes a mistake in that code? And what happens when countries can use that human error as a weapon? Well, sadly, the answer is they find ways to exploit it. By secretly gaining access to the technology that makes our world work, you've possibly never heard of 0 days. But here's why you should know them. It's the term for weaknesses in code that are so dangerous, the companies responsible for managing the code have 0 days to fix it before it's a problem. It's an immediate problem. A 0-day attack can allow hackers to embed inside your software permanently. That's what's so scary here. Shutting off medical equipment if they'd like to. Or how about releasing water from dams? Or simply poisoning our drinking water. Sadly, the possibilities are endless. Sometimes countries will deploy teams of software soldiers to find 0-day weaknesses. And sometimes they'll just buy that info on the black market. Beginning in 2007, as Iran was building its nuclear capabilities, 7 of these 0-day flaws were used to get inside of the Iranians' nuclear computers. And it caused their centrifuges to spin out of control and destroy themselves. It was the world's first known cyber weapon of mass destruction. It was a worm known as Stuxnet. And once the first weapons were unleashed, there was no going back. Since then, these 0-day attacks have been used on and by our foreign adversaries. And while the U.S. leads all other countries according to the National Cyber Power Index, in 2016, an anonymous group of hackers called the Shadow Brokers broke into America's cyber arsenal and released American-made weapons into the wild over the internet, giving enemies all over the world access to code vulnerabilities that were previously kept under wraps, designed by America. And Americans have been facing the consequences with a major uptick in cyber attacks, largely with little help from the government that is still fighting an offensive attack. My colleague, NBC News correspondent Jolene Kent, has a lot more.
Online, it seems that the United States is in a perpetual state of cyber war, escalating from large-scale hacks like SolarWinds.
9 federal agencies and about 100 private sector companies were compromised. An advanced persistent threat actor, likely of Russian origin, was responsible.
To sprawling disasters like the Microsoft Exchange hack.
30,000 entities inside the United States have been impacted by this security flaw in that Microsoft software. So that's a big number. They're saying that this is being done by an apparent Chinese nation-state entity.
Unlike more traditional warfare of decades and centuries past with physical battle lines drawn, today the fronts are on servers worldwide and the smartphones in our pockets.
How would you describe the state of American cybersecurity right now?
Well, I think the country's defenses are getting stronger, but we need to move faster. We're seeing, rising threats from abroad, both from criminals and from nation states.
Brad Smith is the president of Microsoft. He says the company intercepted and thwarted a record-breaking 30 billion email threats last year.
Do you believe that we're at war on the internet right now?
I think most of the time people would say this is not an act of war, but it also doesn't feel like a time of peace, especially when we see not only this technology, these attacks used for, say, something like espionage, but sometimes to damage people's computers, to disrupt the operations of, say, a hospital or a school, to put at risk the electrical grid. These are dangerous steps, and we should not treat them as certainly peacetime as normal.
It certainly doesn't feel like peacetime in local communities across the country.
There was a malicious attempt, well-orchestrated, complex attempt at derailing, destroying the connection which is essential for our students and teachers.
We had a breach, we had a ransomware attack on our information technology systems. That is the way we run our school systems.
Although the United States has thus far averted a devastating attack on the national grid, state-sponsored attempts to take down the foundation of our infrastructure are on the rise.
Cyber is it's the new frontier.
Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell calls it the central bank's top concern over even another global financial crisis.
We spend a great deal of time and money, making sure that we are resilient, making sure that the banks, they spend a lot of time and money. All of these institutions are, constantly under cyber attack. It's one of those things where you never feel like you've done enough.
Another major worry is the disruption of water access.
What kind of signals, Brad, are you seeing that there are big targets on our water systems across the country?
Well, I wouldn't point to the water system specifically as being the top target of our adversaries. I just think it's the one that perhaps we should worry about the most. What we are seeing is a small number of countries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, steadily increase their investments and become more sophisticated in this space.
Microsoft says cybercriminals reap on average $300,000 from smaller scale attacks, like on hospitals and school districts, who sometimes pay ransoms to undo the damage, making them lucrative and relatively easy targets.
Head of IT got up in the morning and he sort of checks things around 5:30 in the morning with his coffee, and he knew something was not quite right away.
Public schools like Haverhill in Massachusetts were rocked by a ransomware attack just last week, forcing school to be canceled as it shut down the entire network, quote, before large-scale corruption of the system occurred.
It was crazy, very crazy. The kids couldn't get, of course, do their homeworks, do their online classes.
According to an investigation by NBC Boston, at least 1 in 6 communities in Massachusetts was infected by ransomware last year, and at least 10 paid hackers taxpayer money to unlock their files.
I think that cyber criminal organizations, typically operating from abroad, target institutions where they know that security has not been advanced as much as it needs to be. So they look at schools or hospitals that may have tight budgets. And they figure, well, if they have tight budgets, they're probably not spending as much as they should to employ an IT administrator or somebody like that.
This comes after the FBI issued a flash alert in March on an increase in ransomware targeting education institutions, using ransomware called PYSA or Mespinoza, focused on schools and seminaries in 12 states. Microsoft says vulnerabilities have only accelerated with more kids going to school from home in the pandemic.
Last year, we saw basically 2 years of change take place in only 2 months. So we are more dependent on this technology than ever before. We're sharing more of ourselves and our data. And so what it means is that the defensive needs that we have are both more important, and to some degree they're broader because we're more reliant on this technology.
In an effort to prevent future attacks, Congress allocated $650 million of the latest $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill for cyber risk management programs at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA.
We are in a continuous low-grade cyber conflict every single day.
Alex Stamos is a former Facebook chief security officer and director of the Stanford Internet Observatory.
Do you think that the funding is adequate to help prevent future attacks?
So I've been very impressed so far by the team that the Biden administration's put together in cyber. There's an executive order coming out soon that's going to have some new rules that I think is important.
But Stamos also argues that more resources should go towards our defensive capabilities and processing the aftermath of major hacks.
When a plane crashes, there are people whose entire job it is to figure out what went wrong and what other plane manufacturers can do better in the future. And we have no function like that on cyber, and we need it. We need effectively a cyber NTSB.
Meanwhile, on the international stage, the U.S. has been absent. In 2018, dozens of countries and over 100 private sector companies and groups signed on to the Paris Call for trust and security in cyberspace. It's an agreement Smith calls a digital Geneva Convention, setting international norms for cybersecurity and cyber warfare. However, under the Trump administration, the U.S. chose not to sign it, along with nation-state cyber aggressors China, Russia, and North Korea.
Every business association is on board. We need the federal government to sign up as well because it sends a strong message to our adversaries.
Have you made that message clear to the Biden administration that you want them to sign up for the Paris Call and sign that agreement?
It is a message that we're conveying in Washington, D.C., including to the administration every day. And I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that in the coming weeks and months we'll see that kind of step.
As Washington attempts to stay ahead of bad actors, American tech giants have taken on central roles as cyber defenders, which Stamos warns is getting complicated for America's own best interests.
Google, Facebook, Microsoft. They have customers around the world. They make revenue around the world. They are regulated by governments around the world. But they have to pick sides when it comes to the cyber side. And for the most part, they pick the sides of the United States and American allies. But that is becoming a more difficult position for them to be in.
Stamos believes that at some point, the business interests of these companies will collide with our national interests.
The companies don't really care about U.S. foreign policy. They care more about their economic bottom lines.
Ultimately, mounting an effective cyber defense here at home also falls to individuals like you and me, not just enormous tech companies and the federal government.
I think the biggest adversary for all of us actually is complacency. We shouldn't wait for that kind of digital 9/11, if you will.
And what can be done now is user-friendly. The practice is almost mundane, like always using multi-factor authentication and installing updates and patches as soon as they're available, rather than procrastinating.
We need to act with urgency, and I think in some ways these most recent episodes have sort of been a wake-up call, and you might say, well, haven't we had enough wake-up calls? Well, not yet. And if we can really respond and move more energetically and with this sense of urgency, I think that's what is going to fundamentally put us in a stronger position.
And joining me now is Chris Krebs. He's a veteran of both the private sector and government cybersecurity. He worked as the director of cybersecurity policy at Microsoft. He also is the former director of CISA, which is known as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency housed within the Department of Homeland Security. He's now the co-founder of Krebs Stamos Group, a private consulting firm founded with his partner, Alex Stamos. Chris Krebs, welcome to Meet the Press Reports.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for having me on.
Big picture, where are we when it comes to our ability to sort of harness cybersecurity defensively, and sort of where are we in protecting the internet and protecting private folks? I look at it and it feels like we're in the 19th century still. You know, the equivalent of that we're still feeling our way around this, trying to even understand the technology. Am I being too harsh?
I don't know if you're being too harsh. The way I think about it, though, is from a day-to-day perspective, what are the equities or the interests of the players on the field? And that's the offensive operators, those that are looking to get intelligence, to infiltrate networks, those that are using technology just for daily purposes, and those that are always out there defending. And I think where the mismatch comes is in that third bucket of activities, that third group of people. The defenders are always, or at least to date, they come in second place, if not third place, to offensive operations and just does the thing work? Does the product work? I mean, when was the last time somebody went to a big box store and picked up a connected device and said, let me read about the security baked into this thing. Where is it on the box? Well, it's not, because it's not a factor in most consumer decision-making processes.
Well, you actually get at, and I'm wondering, is the federal government not set up correctly for this right now? And it's sort of, Ed Giorgio from NSA said this, was quoted this about 6 years ago.
Code making is more important. Code breaking is more fun. When we look at the NSA and we look at the investment of resources, this is another glimpse of what's important. When I was the chief code maker, we were a group of 17 cryptographers. And when I was the chief code breaker, we were a group of 1,700 cryptanalysts.
So we have been prioritizing going on the cyber offense as a military weapon almost ourselves than we had in a defensive posture, correct?
I think that the intelligence collection side and increasingly the military operations with Cyber Command, the budget, the prioritization has certainly been there over the last couple of years, and it's only until recently that we're starting to invest more, not just in the defensive side, and that's in teams like at CISA, which recently got a $650 million boost in the last COVID package, but just in the basic technology upgrades. You know, we've been, I think this is just human nature, but we try to kind of stretch out prior investments as long as we can. And over 50% of the U.S. federal government's tech budget right now is maintaining legacy systems that frankly, should have been retired long ago. And it costs more and is harder to defend those systems. So I don't think that we should deprecate the intelligence the offensive investments. I think we need to up-level the defensive investments to a more appropriate level.
Let me close with this, and that is, you know, I think the American people don't fully understand the threat of this, right? It's sort of like we'll get the call from our bank, we've been hacked, or they'll hear an announcement, hey, be careful, there was a hack. But we're not fully sort of, either we, you know, I sort of feel constantly vulnerable and not vulnerable at all at the same time. You know, it's sort of hard. But I guess put in these terms, how fearful should we be that we are a hack away from having no power or poisoned water?
So I think that the cyber 9/11 or the cyber Pearl Harbor that would result in destructive kinetic effects where, to your point, the grid would go down or water would become toxic or a pipeline would explode. It's in the realm of the possible, but at the same time, we are not Ukraine in that they had a much more fragile electric grid, and the Russians were able to bring that grid down in 2016. We do have a much more resilient grid, and I'm not, I'll take the Texas ERCOT situation over the winter as an exception here for perhaps a lack of reliability. But it's more the intangible nature that makes it so hard for you and me that have to make decisions on a daily basis about how we are connecting and what devices we are using, because security is scary, and security is not something that's easily understandable. So I think from a functional perspective, we're more resilient than you might read about or you might hear about. But from a personal information perspective, I think, what are you sharing when you go online? I mean, the more recent Facebook data dump, the Clubhouse data dump, all of these things, we share so much information, and there's not enough transparency in how that information is being shared. So I think privacy is actually the greatest risk right now, as opposed to a functional disruption of a system.
Chris Krebs, this is a complicated subject. I appreciate you coming on, sharing your expertise and experience, and hopefully we can get more people to worry about this the right way, not the wrong way. Anyway, Chris Krebs, thank you, sir. Up next, I'm going to talk to two cybersecurity experts about the gaps in our cyber defenses and how we can fix them. Welcome back. With me now is Nicole Perlois, who covers cybersecurity for the New York Times. Also, she's author of the new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, The Cyber Weapons Arms Race. It's a, believe it or not, a very gripping book. It almost reads like a spy novel. Also with me is Kirsten Todd, Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute. She also served on President Obama's National Cybersecurity Commission. Kirsten, 5 years ago, the vulnerability of our systems, could be as simple as John Podesta clicking on the wrong link in an email, and it opened up the Russians, and we know how that happened. But as General Nakasone put it the other day, it's not guessing passwords. It's utilizing supply chain operations. It's using zero-day vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities that a provider doesn't even know about. Point is, this is not about phishing emails anymore, is it, Kirsten?
It's not, Chuck. I think what we've confronted right now is a persistent threat across our infrastructure, across our communities. We saw in your earlier segments about ransomware. What we're finding, and this is what Brad Smith said earlier, is that our nation state adversaries are looking for our weakest link. And the challenge is we've provided a lot of weak links for them. So we've really got to be focusing on how do we create a culture of security across our nation. And I think the latter point that was made about individuals, I think one of the greatest challenges that we have right now are that individuals don't appreciate and truly understand and can learn from the accountability and responsibility that we have. And so messaging in cybersecurity and cyber hygiene has become more important now than ever. And I think that's something you're going to see the Biden administration focus on even more than they have before.
Before I get to the nation-state actor issue with Nicole here a second, Kirsten, are we as Americans going to have to, how long do we have to put up with this low-level cyber stick-ups, whether it's the ransomware by a county or, frankly, what happens to individuals? Because it feels like there is no security right now for that, because, frankly, the federal government's so concerned about China and Russia.
Well, I think one of the key pieces here is the security of our infrastructure, and really that looks at small businesses. And one of the priorities that the Biden administration has put out is the ability to help all of the businesses in our supply chain. We no longer have these clear demarcations between what is critical and what isn't critical. The lines around what is critical have become blurred because we're all connected. It is about the connection, the recent hack with Frigata camera systems, how that got into our critical infrastructure. And so we've got to invest in the ability to secure our businesses, our communities. Right now, ransomware is it's the biggest moneymaker in malicious activity when it comes to cybersecurity. The good news in all of this, though, is that the basics that can prevent these types of attacks are out there. And so while the priorities for the Biden administration look at taking a big swing at technology, infrastructure, and government, public-private collaboration, compelling our nation-state adversaries to change their behavior, I would assert strongly that a fourth piece to all of this is how do we educate our citizens on creating a culture of security and helping them understand that.
Yeah, I mean, Chris talked about reading a product label. Took us a while to get people to read about calories and fat content. So maybe we'll get there with cyber. Nicole, I want to talk now the nation state threats here. This is from your book. This was you're quoting Mike McConnell, the former director of national intelligence. And here's what he told you. In looking at any computers of consequence in government, in Congress, at the Department of Defense, aerospace, companies with valuable trade secrets, we've not examined one yet that has not been infected by China. That is chilling, Nicole.
Yep, and he actually told me that quite a while ago, and that was back when China was conducting most of its intellectual property theft operations through phishing. But over the last few years, we have seen China rise in its sophistication in these threats. We are no longer seeing Chinese attacks come through rudimentary phishing attacks anymore. The most recent attack we saw was a Chinese attack on Microsoft that implemented 4 zero-day exploits, secret vulnerabilities in code. And we're seeing China really put the hammer down on its own hacking community. 5 years ago, I would go to these hacking conferences and they would have these competitions and Chinese hackers would be there and they would always win the hacking competitions. They don't show up anymore. They're forbidden from attending these hacking competitions and demonstrating their capabilities because China wants to keep them in-house. And we're starting to see where those capabilities are drifting. And it's the recent Microsoft zero-day attack. It's attacks on Uyghurs, not just in China, but abroad. So they've really risen in their sophistication.
When it comes to threats to us here in America, it does seem as if Russia has more interest in practicing perhaps malign intent. And I guess I was curious your reaction to Chris Krebs, who said, hey, we're not Ukraine. But you have spent a lot of time. You went to Ukraine and you looked at it as I guess it looked like they were practicing. Explain.
That's right. When I went to Ukraine to look at ground zero for a lot of these Russian attacks, Ukraine has really been Russia's test kitchen. They attempted to hack their election. It was caught at the last minute. They did turn off the lights, not once, but twice. They've decimated data on Ukrainian federal agency networks and at companies. And what people in Ukraine said to me on the ground when they did the forensics for these attacks was that it was very clear that Russia was testing one method here, another method there, basically employing the scientific method to see what worked best. And what the Ukrainians said is, from our vantage point, what we see them doing is experimentation. And we believe that this is basically spring training for a future attack on the United States. But the difference is, one, we have a sense of urgency that you seem to lack in the United States because we've been getting beat up and blacked out by the world's savviest digital predator. And the other thing is, we are just not as wired as you are in the United States. You know, we've still not fully digitized our elections. We still do our elections on pen and paper. But all of this seems to escape the consciousness of the United States and gets to some of the things that Kirsten was just talking about greater awareness.
Right. Well, look, there's a lot more to this topic. This has been a great conversation here. Thank you to Nicole and Kirsten. And by the way, because there's more to talk about, Nicole and I have had a chance to go deeper into this topic and into her book on my podcast, the Chuck Toddcast. You can find that conversation wherever you listen. And if you binge the Toddcast, you'll also hear a deep dive on cybersecurity as well with Kirsten Todd. So you can get smarter there. That's all we have for Meet the Press Reports this week. Thanks for being here. Next week, we're going to look at the security and availability of the one thing we all can't live without: clean drinking water. I'll see you then on Peacock and every Sunday on Meet the Press. Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.